Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Seriously, y'all. I mean, that was the thing that Eric was making fun of a minute ago. Let's try that again. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. See, that is a big deal. That is a really big deal because all those things that hold us, all of those things that we allow to hold us, all of those things that we wrap around ourselves. It's like the other day I was cleaning out my garage and I found this really long kind of nylon rope and it was real floppy, and so it was one of those things that when I found it, I kind of picked it up and shoved it in my pocket because I knew I wanted to move it and wrap it up and then, I'm hanging on a hook somewhere. And next thing I knew, I had twisted myself around until that thing was wrapped around my legs because it was something I thought I needed, something I thought I had to have, and then I didn't pay attention to it, and before long, it controlled me. It held me. What holds you? One of the worst problems that I think we face is that this whole notion of letting go of the things that hold us and bind us, we treat it like it's bad news to let go. Joy is a big deal, y'all. The joy of resurrection is a big deal. Because it means that sometimes, yesterday I was running and I thought about, there was a guy in one of my churches one time, and he used to make fun of me because he would see me running at times on the road, and he said, "You see, after I saw you running, that's why I don't do it." I said, "Did I look that bad?" He said, "No, man." He said, "You look so serious and so dour. Nobody ever smiles when they run. Why do I want to do that?" Part of the problem that the church has is that we are so darn serious. Everybody sees us frowning all the time. Why would anybody want to be like that? It's okay every now and then to experience joy. It's okay to let go of what holds you, to believe that you're not going to die if you let go of your anger, your resentment, your hurt, your fear. It's all right. I'm going to give you permission today to do that. Because one of the things that I think is the most important for us, those of us who find this story of resurrection compelling, for the believers, is that we need to act like it. We say Christ is risen, and the response is that Christ is risen indeed. That's just all too easy of a play on words, isn't it? Christ is risen indeed. Doesn't say Christ is risen in word. Doesn't say Christ is risen in thought. It says Christ is risen indeed. So I want to invite you to think with me just a minute about this man, Jesus. Who is this Christ? Now, a minute ago I told somebody, I actually do have notes. I don't look at them very often. So if I get sidetracked, though, they're here. But I feel like every now and then it's good for me to have them because it reminds me that there's something we've got to do today, something really important. I need you. In fact, we need you. In fact, we need us. Worship is the work of the people, so we're going to do a little work. I need you to close your eyes just a minute. I need you to imagine what it's like to be the family of Stephon Clark, the kid who had a cell phone that the cops thought was a gun. Imagine being one of those family members. Imagine the hurt and the pain. Then I need you to imagine if you have been run out of your house by an army that was not afraid to use chemical weapons in your village. And I need you to imagine that you're about to lose everything, all your pictures of your parents and your grandparents and your kids, knowing that your kids might not even make it out alive, and knowing that you might not be there to keep your kids safe. What does that feel like? I need you to imagine that you've just been given the worst diagnosis possible. Imagine what it feels like to think about not being able to be with your friends at a Christmas party a year or 2 years from now, or to watch your kids grow up, or to have kids. I need you to imagine for a minute what it's like to be somebody else who's in pain. That's why we have the cross. The cross is not some waiting for God to spank us because we were bad, and then Jesus took that away. No, the cross says Jesus gets it. It says Jesus is there, and now you can let go of it, because I've felt that too. Amen. Open up your eyes and see that what the cross represents is so much more than just this transaction between God and humanity, where God, in like a dysfunctional fit, decides that everybody has to be punished. Maybe there's another way to read the story of the cross. Maybe the way to read the story of the cross is that all the things that hold us sort of come together in this one moment. It's not so much that when Jesus went to the cross that Jesus kept God from killing us, but maybe it's that all of that pain and all of that hurt and the fear, it shows up right there. Shows up in the worst of the way human beings treat other human beings. And then God takes that and transforms it. Who is this Jesus to you? Who is this Jesus that would do that? Who is this Jesus that would refuse to do violence? Who is this Jesus? We've talked about it for several weeks. And now it's time to call the question. Who do you say Jesus is? Started this whole conversation about a month ago with the idea that in the Gospel of Mark begins his gospel by saying the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, God's Son. At the beginning of the Gospel of Mark says, this is who he is. Jesus of Nazareth, God's Son, the Messiah, the Christ. Then a little bit later on in the Gospel, there's this moment where Jesus asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? And here we are, 2,000 years later, asking the same question. Because it still determines everything about your life and mine. I mean, if you're hearing this story, I believe that in this story is that moment, that sort of Rubicon that once you cross into being present, where this story is told, you've got to answer a pretty fundamental question. Who is Jesus? And Mark is not going to let us off the hook. Mark is going to make us answer questions like, who do you think Jesus was? Do you think he was just a teacher, just a prophet, just a really cool dude? He was pretty awesome. I mean, let's be clear. I mean, how cool is it when you have Jesus show up at your parties and he can actually turn water into wine? You're never going to have a bad party. How much cooler is it when your brother Lazarus dies and this guy can raise him from the dead? Now, that's pretty whacked out. This Jesus, who is he to you? But you also got to answer some other questions. What difference does it make? So what? For years, I would turn youth groups loose in the pulpit after a mission trip and have them talk about what they did on their mission trip and then ask the question of the congregation and of each other. So what? What's the big deal? What's the big deal about Easter? Is it just plastic grass and plastic eggs with candy in them? What's the big deal with Easter? They were selling life-size bunnies the other day for $12 over at Macy's. That was awesome. I did not buy one, either for me or anyone in my family. What's the big deal? We just get little baskets and, like I remember getting a baseball that was really cool. And when I was a kid on Easter, and I pulled that baseball up and it said, made in Haiti. Wasn't that interesting? I suddenly had a lot of questions about where is Haiti? And then started figuring out some things about Haiti. It's like, oh my gosh, you mean everybody doesn't get to have Easter Sunday morning with daffodils and Easter lilies? And everybody doesn't get to wear their cool little three-piece suit, because when I was a kid, man, I could rock a three-piece suit. And bell bottoms and those little stringless shoes with a little buckle across them. I was awesome. I was hot and stylish. And all the girls wore their cool new dresses, and then everybody had to take pictures. Is that what Easter is? If it is, to me, that's a pretty pathetic so what. I mean, like we need any more opportunities to preen as a culture. I looked at that baseball, made in Haiti. And it sticks with me ever since because in Haiti, you know, you're not going to put on a three-piece suit on Easter Sunday morning. It's got to mean something to Haiti. It's got to mean something to Syria. It's got to mean something to Stefan Clark. It's got to mean something to Ferguson. It's got to mean something to Parkland. It's got to mean something to North Korea and South Korea. And it's got to mean something in your gut. It's got to change something. And that's why Mark tells his gospel the way he does. He wants us to hear the story. He wants us to find ourselves in the story. He wants us to see where we are and ask a lot of key questions, not just about what happened historically, but is it still alive? Can this story live? And if this story can live, it's got to live in you and in me. It's got to live in deed. So maybe we better pray. Oh God, days like today, when we really focus in on what happened, we can't see nothing in front of me. And can't feel nothing coming up behind. It's like we broke free. And if we can experience that feeling, that sensation of breaking free from what holds us, then maybe this day we can begin to proclaim your resurrection, not just in word, but in deed. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight and your presence, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, I've got to prepare you for something. This is a teaching moment, right? The Gospel of Mark, written a couple of thousand years ago, had an original ending that a couple of hundred years after, or several years after, people tacked on the ending that tied it up in a nice, neat bow. But when Mark first wrote his gospel, he didn't tie it up in a nice, neat bow. He left it with something really terrifying. For those of you who want the answer today, sorry. Mark leaves us with a ginormous question. So just be prepared for that. Here's how it happens. Mark chapter 16 and verses 1 through 8. It's what we call the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. Remember, Mark began with the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now we end that whole story, 16 chapters later, with this. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they came to the tomb, and they were saying to each other, "Who's going to roll the stone away from the entrance for us?" Stop right here. Sometimes what we've got in our tombs is sealed by a really heavy rock, isn't it? Just saying. When they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, and it was a very large stone. Going into the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe seated on the right side, and they were startled. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him. Go tell the disciples, especially Peter, that he's going on ahead of you into Galilee. He's going on ahead of you. And you'll see him there, just as he told you." Overcome with terror and dread, they fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The end. I mean, like you think about those movies that frustrate you because they ended up with the character looking down the road and you didn't know if they were going to walk or if they were going to sit down or not. This. I mean, it's frustrating. Like, what happens? Like y'all told me that he was raised, but what happened? So these women, the first preachers ever in the history of the gospel, the first preachers were women. And if there's a young woman out there today who has been told that because you're a woman, you shall not preach, the Bible stands in direct contradiction to that idea. If you have ever been wondering whether or not the gospel could come to the church without women preachers, the answer is no. And right here's my proof. That's the first thing. And if there's anybody out here who feels like what you're hearing is a story that might compel you to want to change the way you look at your life, then guess what? You're with them. You become a preacher of the gospel too. You become a preacher of the gospel. I love this moment. Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. Right there is that dramatic D minor chord, which they say is the saddest chord in all of music, followed by a dramatic C chord, C major. And there it sits. Do you believe this story? And Mark leaves us with this big-ass question. Sorry. Well, you're awake. All right. Go back to the notes. Well, okay. Please don't tell my wife I did that. She will be so horrified that I just did that. And don't tell Dave, whatever you do, Pastor Dave, gosh. All right. Woo! All right. Okay, how do you recover? Well, you turn the notes away. All right, so here's the thing. So Mark leaves us this dramatic question. And this dramatic question like, do you believe it? Can you believe it? Because everything hinges on this. There was this moment where these women saw an empty tomb and they had to go. The guys weren't there. The guys were in an upper room. And I don't know what the women told those dudes, but whatever it was so compelling that it changed everything. It made them willing to risk their lives. And then something else had to happen in that upper room that was so compelling that those guys were willing to even give up their lives, their families, their fortune, anything they had, because the story was such a big deal. Something gripped them in their guts. So much so that they forgot themselves. They forgot everything that was supposed to be meaning before that. And what they latched onto was the idea that Jesus was risen, that the grave, that ultimate reality that we all face, that the grave could not hold him. And we've all got those tombs. There's so much evidence that the tomb is the last word, right? We've all buried relatives. That moment when the preacher looked at my brother and me and said, boys, you've gone as far as you can go now with your dad. That moment in the relationship when you say to the other person, is there no way? And they say, no, there is no way. That moment when you have taken a relationship and you have buried it and left it behind. That moment, insert your own. That moment when you said, I'll work harder for less money, and they say no. We've all had to bury things. We've all put them in the tomb, and the stone has held them in, and maybe we've held on to it and lugged it around with us this whole time, and maybe we need to drop the stone. To be totally honest, I can't prove that the resurrection happened. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. But I have heard the story told in ways that were so compelling that it made me know it in my heart. There have been moments when I have shut my eyes and so empathized with people, and it broke my heart. And I've wondered, where could hope possibly be? And then somebody in those most horrible of circumstances dared to love me as privileged as I am. Those moments when somebody dared to make me know it was okay that I just totally screwed up in preaching the sermon. And you dared to keep on loving me. Those moments when forgiveness happened in the midst of resentment and hate and anger. Those moments when I couldn't see myself doing anything on Easter morning except saying to a crowd of people, Christ is risen, and hearing back, Christ is risen indeed. The resurrection has to become real to us in some way. by the telling of a story, by an experience, because we weren't there and I can't prove it and you can't prove it, and yet it's something that grips us, it changes us, and it's mystical and mysterious and I don't understand it, and it's the power of the Holy Spirit, and I can't imagine why anybody would ever have their heart broken by anything I would say in a sermon. I can't imagine how anybody can hear a song sung and have their spirits renewed and rejoice. In those times when it is the darkest, that's when the light shines the brightest. And maybe that's our problem. Our pupils are so dilated that we just can't see because it's so bright around us. Resurrection is hard to preach because there have been so many people who have done it, and all of us, if we're honest, have a big stinking question mark, just like the very end of Mark. Is it real? Can it possibly be real? And Mark leaves us that big question mark because he wants to ask us the question, do you believe it? It's not enough for me to stand up here and pound my fist on the table. Or if I were a good Southern preacher like we were talking about this morning, if I could take my handkerchief and wipe the sweat off of my head and throw it down, don't you believe? The real belief is going to come when you start practicing resurrection. When you start living your life as a practice of resurrection. Has the story changed you? I don't know. One time the story changed me when I sat down and read the Gospel of Mark from beginning to end in one sitting. One time the story changed me when I sat in a cathedral alone trying to figure out if there was anybody in the universe that actually cared about me. One time the story became real to me when I laid my mother in the ground and walked away knowing that I was going to be okay. One time the story came to me when I watched some good friends who had nothing dance offering plates with everything they had down the aisle. Dancing. Who with nothing dances to give their stuff away? The resurrection means that you're going to do something, you're going to be about a story that does not make sense. You're going to be about a story that doesn't compute. It's a story that says that peace is stronger than war. It's a story that says that service is stronger than selfishness. It's a story that says live differently, believe and live differently. It's a story that says take a risk for the sake of the gospel instead of playing it safe because that's the conventional play. It's the story that says do something different, believe in what happens in the long run and give yourself to it. It's the story that says be joyful even though you have considered all the facts. It's a story that says laugh because laughter has immeasurable importance. It's a story that says if you want to be happy, spend some time praying for that person that you hate. It's a story that says if you're going to believe that Christ is risen, then Christ has got to be risen indeed. Practice resurrection. Practice resurrection. Stop looking at yourself in the mirror and worrying that you're not good enough. Stop looking at yourself in the mirror and feeling like this morning, man, I got that cowlick up here and it's driving me nuts. It's like, what are they going to think of me? Stop worrying about that. Live the resurrection. Don't just say it. Don't just say you believe it. Do it. Do resurrection means that you wade into the places that are the most terrifying. It means that you enter the conversations that are the most horrifying. And you do it because you know that Christ is risen. Because you know, like, what's the worst they're going to do to us? Kill us? Okay, we got resurrection. What do you got? It's a story that says, you know what? I'm gonna risk my life for the gospel. It's a story that says, you know what? I'm gonna give up making bazillions because what really matters is that I can make human-to-human contact, eye to eye, and see another person as a child of God. That I can look into their fear and be willing to give them compassion and presence. knowing that they could look into mine the same way, knowing that's how Jesus looked at me. Pope Francis said, Jesus no longer belongs to the past, but he lives in the present, and he's projected forward into the future. Jesus is the everlasting today of God. And this is how the newness of God appears to the women, the disciples, and all of us, as victory over sin and evil and death and fear, over everything that crushes life and makes it seem less human. And this is the message that is meant for me and for you. How often does love have to tell us, why do you look for the living among the dead? Our daily problems and worries wrap us up in ourselves, in sadness and bitterness, and that is where death is. That is not the place to look for the one who is alive. If you want to believe, practice it until you do. And if you believe it, practice it so that others might see. And if you have practiced it, then you can preach it.